Some people think a gate is just a suggestion until it stops being one. The sound hit before the sunrise did. A low metallic groan, then that sharp, hollow crunch of steel giving way like it had no business standing there in the first place. I was already awake. You learn to wake up early when you run a ranch. For 30 a.m., coffee black, boots on gravel. But that sound still cut through the quiet like it didn't belong. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold morning air biting at my face, carrying that unmistakable smell of burnt rubber and hot engine oil drifting across 40 acres of land that had been in my family longer than most of the houses in this county had even existed. And there she was, white SUV, same one, sitting halfway through what used to be my gate. Again, the hinges were twisted, one post leaning at an angle like it had finally given up trying to do its job. The gravel under her tires was still settling, crunching softly as the engine idled like nothing had happened. Like this was normal. Like my property line was just another shortcut on her morning drive. Rebecca Whitmore, HOA president, professional rule enforcer, self-appointed authority on what everyone else should do with land she didn't own. She didn't even look at the damage, didn't get out, didn't apologize. Just that same tight grip on the steering wheel, sunglasses on even though the sun hadn't cleared the hills yet, and then she rolled forward, straight through what was left of my gate like it was air. 7 times. That's how many times she'd done it this month. I counted. You stop counting after a while if you don't want to admit what's really happening. But I counted. Because every time I fixed it, every time I reset the posts, realigned the hinges, poured new concrete, I told myself the same thing. This would be the last time. That she'd get the message. That people respected boundaries when they were clear enough. Turns out, some people don't see boundaries. They see inconvenience. The smell of fresh-cut metal still lingered from the repair I'd finished just 2 days ago. My tools were still sitting by the barn. Wrench. Level. A bag of fast-setting concrete I hadn't even opened yet. I could feel the grit of dust between my fingers as I picked up one of the broken hinge pins, still warm from friction. My jaw tightened without me thinking about it. Not anger. Not yet. Just calculation. Because here's the thing about patterns, you can't argue with them. You can't reason with them. You either accept them, or you change them. I watched her taillights disappear past the oak line, deeper into land she had no right to cross, and for the first time since this started, I didn't walk toward the damage to fix it. I just stood there, listening to the silence come back, feeling the weight of it settle in. 7 times. Same path, same speed, same assumption that nothing would stop her, that I would keep rebuilding the same gate, over and over again. I looked at the crooked post, then at the stretch of open ground beside it. 30 feet wide. Flat. Solid. Perfect line of sight from the road. And that's when it clicked. Not how to fix the gate. No. I was done fixing gates. I was going to build something she couldn't ignore. Something she couldn't drive through. Something that didn't bend just because she decided it should. Because she thought she knew exactly how this story was going to go. She thought I was predictable. She thought wrong. I did not touch the gate that morning. That was the first thing that felt wrong. For months, my routine had been automatic. Coffee, boots, tools, fix whatever she broke, repeat. There was a rhythm to it, like breathing or checking fence lines before the heat rolled in. But that day, the tools stayed where they were. The hinge pin sat in my palm a little longer than it needed to, still warm, edges rough against my skin, and then I set it down on the porch rail like it did not matter anymore. Because it did not. Not the way it used to. My name is Ethan Cole. I own 40 acres of ranch land just outside of Fredericksburg, Texas. Been here my whole life. My grandfather bought this place in 1968 when this county was more cattle than concrete, and he used to say land only works for you if you respect it enough to understand it. Every fence line, every drainage slope, every inch of boundary had a purpose. You did not guess. You measured. You did not assume. You verified. That. Lesson stuck. I run a small operation. Nothing fancy. Some cattle, some repair work on the side. I fix engines, weld broken frames, keep things running that most people would replace. It is honest work. Quiet work. The kind that does not attract attention unless something goes wrong. And lately, something had been going wrong every single week at exactly the same spot. That gate was not just decoration. It marked the legal boundary of my property, surveyed and recorded down to the inch. Steel posts set in concrete 30 inches deep. Reinforced hinges rated for equipment access. I built it myself 2 years ago after replacing an older wooden one that finally gave out. I remember the smell of fresh-cut cedar from the original posts, the way the sawdust stuck to sweat in the Texas heat. This one was supposed to last decades. Instead, it lasted about 3 weeks before Rebecca decided it was optional. The first time she drove through, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe she misjudged the turn. Maybe she did not realize the road ended at my boundary. I walked over that afternoon, knocked on her door, kept it polite. She answered with that same composed smile, the kind that looks practiced, like it belongs in a real estate listing. She told me the community needed access through my land to reach a better route to the main road. Said it like it was already decided, like I had just not been informed yet. I remember the faint smell of her perfume mixing with fresh paint in her entryway, something expensive trying too hard to feel welcoming. I explained the property line, showed her the survey map on my phone. She barely glanced at it, just nodded like I was talking about the weather. The next morning, she drove through the gate again. That was when I installed the camera. Small unit mounted on the oak tree about 15 feet back from the line. Clear angle. Timestamp. No guesswork. The footage did not lie. Same vehicle. Same path. Same steady speed like the gate was invisible. I watched those clips more times than I care to admit. Not because I needed proof. I already had that. I was studying the pattern, the angle of approach, the way she lined up her tires, the exact point where the hinge gave out under pressure. Every detail mattered. Because if you want to stop something, you do not react to it. You understand it first. And standing there that morning, looking at what was left of my gate, I realized something simple. She was not going to stop. Not because she could not. Because she had decided she did not have to. And that meant the solution was not another gate. By the third week, it stopped feeling like a coincidence and started feeling like a routine she expected me to follow. Not just the driving through the gate. Everything around it. The timing. The paperwork. The way the pressure built up just enough to make most people give in and call it compromise. That is how people like Rebecca operate. Not loud. Not obvious. Just constant. Like a drip you ignore until the whole ceiling starts to sag. 2 days after that last broken hinge, I found the letter. Certified mail. Thick paper. The kind that feels official before you even read it. It was sitting in my mailbox, edges sharp, my name printed clean across the front like it belonged there. I could smell the ink when I opened it, fresh and deliberate. Violation notice. Obstruction of community access. Non-compliant barrier structure. Daily fines beginning at $50 and increasing for continued non-cooperation. I read it twice, slow, letting each word settle in like dust. Then I folded it once and set it on the kitchen table next to my coffee. The mug was still warm, steam barely visible in the early light coming through the window. Outside, the land looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Fence line straight, grass moving in the wind. Nothing about it suggested I owed anyone access to it. But according to that letter, I did. That afternoon, I drove into town. 10 miles of open road, tires humming steady on asphalt, heat rising in waves off the pavement even though it was barely noon. I did not go to a lawyer. Not yet. I went to the county records office. Old building. Brick faded from years of sun. Air inside cool and dry with that distinct smell of paper and time. The clerk barely looked up when I walked in. I asked for my property file. Parcel number memorized. She printed it without a word. I stood there flipping through pages, fingers, brushing over survey maps, boundary descriptions, easement records. Legal language most people skim past because it feels like it belongs to someone else. Not me. I read every line. Twice. There was no easement. Not recorded. Not implied. Not pending. Nothing granting access across my land to anyone, HOA or otherwise. Clean title. Clear boundary. Exactly what my grandfather paid for and what I had maintained ever since. I stepped outside, the sun hitting hard enough to make me squint, and leaned against the hood of my truck. The metal was already hot. I could feel it through my shirt as I laid the papers flat and read them again just to be certain. Because once you act on something like this, there is no halfway. Either you are right or you are wrong, and the difference is written in ink long before anyone raises their voice. That was when I understood the real pattern. It was not about the gate. Not really. The gate was just the test. A physical thing she could push through to see if I would push back. The letter was the real move. Paper over pressure. Authority without foundation. She was counting on me not checking. counting on me seeing official language and assuming she had already done the work. Most people would. It is easier that way. Cheaper too, if you do not factor in what it costs later. I folded the documents carefully, slid them back into the envelope, and sat there for a minute listening to the faint tick of my engine cooling down. That steady clicking sound, like a clock marking out something you cannot take back once it starts. She thought this was about access. She thought I would argue, maybe negotiate, maybe widen the gate or move it back. She thought I would stay inside the problem she created. But standing there with those records in my hand, I realized something else. If there is no right of way, then there is no obligation to accommodate one. And if there is no obligation, then the only question left is how far I am willing to go to make that boundary permanent. The next morning came quieter than usual, and that was the first sign something had shifted. No engine noise at dawn. No crunch of gravel cutting through the air before the sun cleared the horizon. Just wind, moving through the grass and the low hum of insects waking up with the light. I stood on the porch with my coffee, the ceramic warm against my palm, and watched the empty stretch where the gate used to be. Open, unobstructed, exactly the way she wanted it. And for the first time, I let it stay that way. Not because I agreed, because I needed her to believe I had given up. Around 9, I heard it. That familiar engine, steady and confident, rolling down the county road like it owned the space between the fences. The white SUV slowed just enough to line up with the opening, then turned in without hesitation. No pause, no check, just muscle memory. She drove through clean, tires pressing fresh tracks into the dirt I had not bothered to smooth out. I stayed where I was, leaning against the post, watching her cross deeper into land she still had no legal claim to. She did not see me at first. When she did, her expression did not change. No surprise, no apology, just that same calm certainty, like this outcome had always been inevitable. She rolled her window down halfway. I could hear the faint click of the button, the soft whir of the motor. "Looks like you finally understood," she said, voice even, controlled, carrying just enough to reach me across the distance. The air smelled like dry soil and engine heat, the kind that settles in your lungs and stays there. I did not respond right away. I took a sip of coffee, let the silence stretch just a second longer than it needed to. "I understand exactly where my property line is," I said. Simple. No edge. Just fact. She smiled at that. Not wide. Not friendly. The kind of smile that assumes it has already won. "Then you understand access benefits everyone," she replied, like she was explaining something basic to someone who had missed the point. I nodded once, slow, like I was considering it. "You should probably keep a copy of your paperwork in the car," I said, setting the mug down on the railing beside me. "Might come in handy." Her smile tightened just enough to notice if you were looking for it. A small shift. Barely there. Then it was gone. She raised the window, pressed the accelerator, and continued through like the conversation had settled something in her favor. I listened to the engine fade out past the tree line, the sound thinning until it blended back into the quiet. And then it was just me again. Me, the open ground, and a decision that had already been made. By noon, I was back in the truck. The sun sat high and heavy, heat pressing down on the hood until it shimmered. I drove past her subdivision entrance on the way into town. Clean signage, fresh paint, a neat row of identical mailboxes lined up like they had been measured with a ruler. Order, control, the kind of place that depends on rules to feel stable. I kept driving. Straight to the county permit office this time. Different building. Same smell of paper and climate-controlled air. I pulled a number, waited my turn, listened to the low murmur of conversations that had nothing to do with me. When my number was called, I stepped up and laid the survey documents flat on the counter. "I need to know my setback limits for a permanent structure along this boundary," I said. The clerk adjusted her glasses, scanned the paperwork, tapped a few keys. "Agricultural zoning," she said after a moment. "You have flexibility. As long as you stay within your property line and meet height restrictions, you are clear." Clear. That word landed heavier than it should have. I nodded once, thanked her, and took the documents back. Outside, the heat felt different now. Not oppressive, focused, like it was pushing everything into sharp definition. I stood there for a second, looking out across the parking lot, hearing the distant rumble of trucks on the highway, feeling the weight of what came next settle into place. She thought the open gate meant compliance. She thought silence meant surrender. What she did not realize was that I had stopped reacting. And once you stop reacting, you start building something else entirely. I started before sunrise the next day, not because I had to, but because that is when decisions feel the most honest. The air was cool, carrying that faint scent of dry grass and metal from the tools laid out in the back of my truck. I stood at the edge of the opening where the gate used to be, boots pressed into dirt that still held the tracks from her tires, and I did not rush. This was not repair work. This was planning. I drove the first stake into the ground at exactly the point where her front tire always crossed the boundary line. I knew that spot by memory now. Angle, distance, pressure. The same way you learn the feel of a wrench before it slips. The hammer rang out sharp against the quiet morning, each strike clean, deliberate, echoing across the open land like a marker being set in something more permanent than soil. I paced out the line from there, 30 feet across. Straight run, no curves, no weak points. I measured twice, then again, because once this went up, there would be no adjusting it to make anyone else comfortable. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to turn the ground hard and stubborn under the shovel. Sweat gathered at the back of my neck, dust clinging to my hands as I worked the first trench line, cutting into the earth inch by inch. 12 inches deep for the footing. Enough to hold weight, enough to stay where it was put. The smell of fresh dirt rose up with every scoop, dry and heavy, mixing with the faint tang of steel from the rebar stacked beside me. I lined them up one by one, running the length of the trench, tying them off with wire that bit into my fingers just enough to remind me to stay precise. No shortcuts. Not this time. Around noon, I heard it again. That engine. Same tone. Same approach. I did not look up right away. I finished tying the last section of rebar, tightened it until it held firm, then stood and wiped my hands on a rag already dark with dust and grease. She slowed as she reached the opening, probably noticing the stakes first, then the trench cutting across her usual path. The SUV rolled to a stop for the first time since this started. Silence settled between us, thicker than before, broken only by the faint ticking of her engine cooling in the heat. She stepped out this time, heels on gravel, controlled, measured. "What is this?" she asked, looking at the line I had started carving into the ground. I picked up the tape measure, rechecked the distance between two stakes like her question did not change anything. "Foundation," I said. One word. "Enough." She let out a short breath through her nose, something between a laugh and disbelief. "You cannot just build whatever you want," she replied, folding her arms, posture straight, voice carrying that same practiced authority. I reached into the truck, pulled out the folded permit papers, and held them out just long enough for her to see the county stamp at the top. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, edges crisp, ink still fresh. "I am not building whatever I want," I said, sliding them back into the folder. "I am building exactly what I am allowed to." Her eyes narrowed just a fraction. Not anger. Not yet. Just recalculation. She looked past me at the trench again, then back toward the road behind her, like she was measuring something in her head that no longer lined up the way she expected. "This is unnecessary," she said finally, voice tighter now. I shrugged once, simple. So was driving through my gate 7 times. The words hung there for a second, not loud, not aggressive, just placed where they needed to be. She did not respond. Not immediately. Instead, she got back into her SUV, closed the door with a controlled motion, and sat there for a moment before turning the wheel and backing out the way she came for the first time since any of this started. I watched her go, the sound of gravel shifting under her tires different now, less certain, fading as she pulled back onto the county road. Then I turned back to the trench, picked up the shovel, and kept digging. Because this was not about stopping her for one day. This was about making sure she never had a path to begin with. By the end of the first day, the line was no longer just an idea in my head. It was visible, measurable, real. The trench cut clean across the opening where her tires used to pass, straight as a survey line, edges sharp against the dry ground. I stood there at sunset, hands sore, shirt stiff with dust and sweat, and looked at it the way my grandfather used to look at a finished fence post. Not with pride, with certainty. Because pride fades, certainty holds. The next morning, the concrete truck arrived just after 8. You could hear it before you saw it, that low diesel rumble rolling across. The hills, steady and heavy like something that was not going to change direction once it started moving. The driver pulled up slow, tires crunching over gravel, engine idling as he stepped out and looked at the trench. "This where you want it?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag already stained from 100 other jobs. I nodded once. "Straight through. Full run." He gave a short nod back. "No questions, just work." The chute dropped into place with a metallic clank, and then the first pour began. Thick, gray, deliberate. Concrete does not rush. It settles. It fills space exactly as it is given, no more, no less. I watched it spread into the trench, covering the rebar, locking everything into position inch by inch. The smell hit first. That sharp, mineral scent of wet cement mixing with dust and heat, rising into the air like something permanent taking shape. I worked alongside him, guiding the flow, smoothing the surface, making sure there were no gaps, no weak spots. Every section mattered, because this was not just a barrier. It was a statement written in material that does not negotiate. By noon, the footing was set. Not finished, but set enough to hold what came next. The sun sat high overhead, pressing down hard, drying the top layer just enough to give it that dull, solid look. I ran my hand along the edge, feeling the texture shift from wet to firm, the surface resisting just slightly under pressure. Good. That is what I needed. The forms went up next. Wood panels anchored along both sides of the trench, held in place with stakes driven deep and tight. I measured every section again. Height, alignment, distance from the property line. No mistakes. Not here. Not now. Around mid-afternoon, I heard it again. Not as confident this time. The engine slowed earlier, the approach less direct. She stopped farther back from the opening, the SUV idling on the edge of the road like she was deciding whether to continue or not. I kept working, hammer tapping against wood, each strike steady, controlled. I did not look up until she stepped out. The sound of her door closing carried across the distance, sharper than before, less controlled. "You are actually doing this," she said, voice louder now, not quite matching the calm she had held onto the day before. I adjusted one of the forms, tightened the brace, checked the level. "I told you I was," I replied, keeping my tone even, like we were discussing something routine. She took a few steps closer, heels sinking slightly into the loose dirt near the trench. Her eyes moved across the setup, the concrete footing, the forms rising above it, the clear line that was no longer something she could ignore. "This will block access completely," she said, like she needed to hear it out loud to believe it. I nodded once. "That is the point." The wind picked up just enough to move dust across the ground between us, a thin layer shifting over the place where her tires used to pass. She looked back toward the road, then at the structure again, her expression tightening in a way that had nothing to do with confusion anymore. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a change she did not control. "You are making a mistake," she said, quieter now, but heavier. I set the hammer down on the truck bed, the metal ringing once before settling into silence. "No," I said, meeting her eyes for the first time that day. "I am finishing one." She stood there for another second, like she was waiting for something to shift back in her favor. It did not. Then she turned, got back into her SUV, and drove off without crossing the line. I watched the dust settle behind her as the sound of the engine faded into the distance. Then I turned back to the forms, picked up the level, and kept building. Because once the foundation is set, everything else is just a matter of time. By the third day, it started to look less like construction and more like inevitability. The forms stood solid along the line, straight and uncompromising, holding the shape of what was coming next. I woke up before the alarm, the kind of wakefulness that comes when your mind is already ahead of your body, running through measurements, angles, timing. The air was cooler that morning, carrying a faint hint of moisture, enough to slow the curing just right. I stepped outside with my coffee, the surface of it still dark and steady, and looked at the structure taking shape where an open path used to be. No hesitation now. No second guessing. Just process. I started mixing the next batch by hand before the truck arrived, smaller pours to reinforce the base, tightening every inch of the foundation. The shovel scraped against the mixing tray in a steady rhythm, metal on metal, each motion deliberate. Water, powder, fold, repeat. The smell of cement dust rose up again, sharper this time, settling into the back of my throat as I worked. It is a smell you do not forget once you have built something that matters. Around mid-morning, the delivery truck brought the block. Pallets stacked high, each one uniform, gray, heavy with purpose. I ran my hand across the top brick, feeling the rough texture, edges clean, weight solid. This was not temporary. This was not something you move when it becomes inconvenient. This was the kind of structure that stays exactly where you put it because it was meant to. I set the first block at the corner, pressing it down into the mortar bed, checking the level twice before letting go. The line stretched out from there, one block at a time, each one locking into the next, forming something that did not rely on permission to exist. The sun climbed higher, heat pressing down, drying the mortar faster than I would have liked, forcing me to move with a pace that stayed controlled but steady. Sweat ran down my back, dust clung to my arms, and still I kept the line straight. No gaps, no drift, just structure. By early afternoon, the wall had reached knee height. Enough to change the space. Enough to make it clear that the opening was no longer an option. That was when I heard her again. Slower this time. The engine idling longer before she moved closer. I did not stop working. I placed another block, pressed it into position, adjusted it with a firm tap until the level settled exactly where it needed to be. Only then did I look up. She stayed inside the vehicle at first, window down, watching, not speaking, just observing in a way she had not before. The air between us felt different, less certain on her side, more settled on mine. "You are serious about this," she said finally, voice quieter, less controlled than before. I wiped my hands on a cloth, leaving streaks of gray across the fabric, and nodded once. "I have been serious the whole time." She looked at the wall again, then at the ground where the trench had been, then back at me. You could see it happening. The recalculation. The moment where assumption meets reality and has to adjust or break. "There are other ways to handle this," she said, like she was offering a solution that had not already been considered. I set the next block in place, pressed it down, checked the line. "There were," I replied. "You drove through all of them." The words settled heavier than the concrete beneath us. She did not respond. Not immediately. Instead, she reached up and adjusted her sunglasses, a small movement, controlled, but slower than before. Then she rolled the window up and eased the SUV back, reversing carefully this time, tires avoiding the edge of the worksite. No attempt to cross. No assumption that she still could. I watched her turn back toward the road, the engine fading out as she left. Then I turned back to the wall, picked up the trowel, and continued laying block. Because the difference between a barrier and a boundary is commitment. And I was committed all the way to the top. The fourth day started with a different kind of silence. Not the calm, open quiet of the ranch, but something tighter. Anticipation. The wall stood waist-high now, stretching clean across the boundary, casting a sharp shadow over the ground that used to carry tire tracks. I ran my hand along the top edge as I walked the line, feeling the slight roughness where the mortar had set overnight, solid and unmoving. It was no longer a project. It was a presence. You could not ignore it even if you tried. The air smelled faintly of dried cement and sun-warmed dust, the kind that sticks in your nose and reminds you something permanent has taken root. I started early, laying the next course before the heat could slow me down. Trowel, mortar, block, press, level, repeat. Each motion fell into rhythm, steady and controlled, like the wall itself was guiding the process forward. By mid-morning, it was chest-high, enough that you could not step over it, enough that you had to make a decision before approaching it. That was when I heard more than one engine, not just hers. 2 vehicles this time. One I recognized, the other unfamiliar. They slowed together near the road, tires crunching over gravel in uneven rhythm, like the moment did not belong to them the way it used to. I kept working. One more block set. One more line checked. Only then did I look up. Rebecca stepped out first, sunglasses on, posture straight, but something in the way she held her shoulders had changed. Less relaxed, less certain. The second man got out of the other vehicle, clipboard in hand, shirt tucked too neatly for ranch work. County logo on the door behind him. Inspection. That was her move. Paper instead of pressure this time. He walked up to the line slowly, eyes scanning the structure, taking in the height, the alignment, the footing already set beneath it. I stepped back just enough to give him space, wiping my hands on the same dust-stained cloth. "Morning," he said, voice neutral, professional. I nodded once. Morning. He flipped through a few pages on the clipboard, then looked at the wall again. We received a request to verify compliance on a new structure, he said, glancing briefly in Rebecca's direction before focusing back on the build. I reached into the truck, pulled out the permit folder, and handed it over without a word. The paper felt lighter than it had the day before, like the weight had already shifted elsewhere. He scanned it, eyes moving line by line, then crouched near the base, checking the setback, the distance from the boundary markers I had driven in at the start. The tape measure clicked softly as it extended, the sound small but precise in the open air. A few seconds passed, then a few more. Rebecca stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching him like the outcome could still tilt in her favor if she held her posture long enough. The wind moved lightly across the field, carrying the dry scent of earth between us. Finally, he stood up, folded the tape back in, and nodded once. Everything looks within regulation, he said, matter of fact, handing the papers back to me. Proper permits, correct setback, height within limits. The words landed clean. No hesitation. No room to reinterpret. Rebecca's expression tightened, just enough to break the surface of control she had been holding on to. That cannot be right, she said, stepping forward, voice sharper now, the edge finally showing. The inspector did not look at her right away. He capped his pen, clipped it back onto the clipboard, then met her gaze evenly. Ma'am, based on county records and current zoning, he is fully compliant. Fully compliant. I could almost feel the phrase settle into the ground alongside the foundation. She opened her mouth like she had something else ready, something prepared, but the words did not come out the same way this time. They hesitated, just long enough to matter. The inspector gave a polite nod, turned, and walked back toward his vehicle without waiting for a response. Engine started. Gravel shifted. And just like that, the last piece of her leverage drove away. The silence that followed felt different. Not empty. Settled. Rebecca stood there for another moment, looking at the wall, then at me, then back at the line she used to cross without thinking. For the first time, she did not speak. She just turned, got back into her SUV, and closed the door without slamming it. Controlled, but not confident. The engine started, and she pulled away slowly, keeping her distance from the edge, like the boundary had finally become visible to her. I watched until the sound faded, then turned back to the wall, picked up the trowel, and set the next block in place. Because at that point, it was not just about building something strong. It was about finishing something undeniable. The final course went in just after sunrise on the 6th day, and the sound it made was different from every block before it. Not louder, not sharper, just final. The trowel scraped once across the mortar bed, a smooth, even line, and I set the last block into place with both hands, pressing it down until it settled exactly where it was meant to stay. I checked the level out of habit, even though I already knew it was right. The bubble centered. No adjustment needed. I stepped back slowly, boots pressing into ground that had not seen tire tracks in days, and looked at it from end to end. 40 feet across. Solid. Straight. Chest high and capped clean along the top. No gaps. No weak points. No suggestion that it might move if someone decided it should. The morning light hit the surface at an angle, casting a long shadow across the dirt where her SUV used to cut through like it belonged there. Now it just stopped. Clean. Unquestionable. I ran my hand along the top edge one last time, feeling the texture where the mortar had set overnight, rough in places, smooth in others, all of it locked together into something that did not ask for permission to exist. The air was still, carrying that faint mix of dust and cured concrete, a smell that settles into your clothes and stays there long after the work is done. Around 8, I heard it again. That engine. Slower than before. Careful. It did not come straight in this time. It eased down the road, paused longer at the edge, like it was measuring distance instead of assuming it. I did not move. I stayed where I was, one hand resting lightly on the top of the wall, watching without reacting. She pulled up to the boundary and stopped completely. The SUV idled there, engine low, steady, but not confident anymore. The front of it sat a few feet back from the wall, enough space to show she understood what was in front of her. The window rolled down, slow, controlled. She looked at the wall first, not at me. Her eyes followed the line from one end to the other, taking in the height, the footing, the fact that there was no opening left to negotiate. Then she looked at me. No smile this time. No rehearsed calm. Just a quiet recognition of something she could not adjust. "So that is it," she said, voice even, but lower than it had been all week. I nodded once. "That is it." The wind moved lightly across the field, lifting a thin layer of dust that drifted along the base of the wall, settling into the seams like it had always belonged there. She let out a slow breath, almost imperceptible, and leaned back slightly in her seat. "There is no access through here anymore," she said, not asking, just stating what she could now see. "There never was," I replied. The words did not need emphasis. They landed on their own. She looked at the wall again, then down at the ground in front of her tires, then back toward the road behind her. The calculation was gone now. No angles left to consider. No leverage left to use. Just a boundary that existed whether she agreed with it or not. After a second, she reached up, pressed the button, and the window slid closed with a soft mechanical hum. The engine revved slightly as she shifted into reverse, the tires rolling back over gravel that sounded different now, like it knew it was leaving instead of passing through. She turned the wheel, lined up with the road, and drove away without looking back. I stood there until the sound faded completely, until the ranch settled back into the quiet it had before any of this started. Then I looked at the wall again, not as something new, but as something that had always been there, just waiting to be built. My grandfather used to say boundaries are only as strong as your willingness to hold them. Turns out he was right, because the gate kept getting broken. The wall did not. And sometimes, the difference between being pushed aside and standing your ground is not about force. It is about knowing exactly where your line is and making sure it stays there.